So, boa tarde, good afternoon, everybody.
So that's me. Hello. So that's my share now.
Okay.
So I'm supposed to do that. Opa, então, pessoal, boa tarde. Desculpe pelos problemas técnicos aqui. Também envolve conexão e também o detalhe de relação do StreamYard. Então, acho que está todo mundo me vendo aqui. Então, boa tarde, claro, você sabe que sou o Eduardo Boechat, professor do setor de latim do nosso departamento de letras clássicas. Então, um privilégio hoje de apresentar a nossa convidada de honra da nossa abertura da 39ª Semana de Estudos Clássicos. Tá. Antes de mais nada, queria agradecer aos professores que me antecederam aqui, a presidente da semana, a Ana Tereza, a vice, a Simone Bodacus, que é também a nossa chefe de departamento atual, a professora Sônia Reis, que é a diretora da nossa Faculdade de Letras, a decana Cristina, o meu amigo Rainer, que é o responsável pelo nosso PPG. Então, obrigado a todo mundo, a todas essas palavras, olha, calorosas e importantes que foram expressas aqui. E a verdade é o seguinte: como é importante, é realmente importante que nós nos demos apoio mútuo, né? E que num momento difícil e conturbado que nós vivemos, é muito importante que nós nos ajudemos, nos apoiemos uns aos outros. Então, espero que todos estejam me ouvindo. Então, espero que todos estejam me ouvindo bem, me vendo. Então vou lá passar para a minha função aqui, que é apresentar a professora Anne Sheppard, né? Então, o título dela, ela é professora emérita da faculdade da Royal Holloway University of London. Ela já tem vários anos, ela já trabalha lá desde a década de 90. Antes ela trabalhou, ela ensinou filosofia em Oxford, trabalhou lá no departamento de Classics da University of London, em filosofia na Sheppard, eu chamo ela de Anne, porque ela foi professora Anne, porque ela foi a supervisor doutorado na supervisor é uma espécie de segunda orientadora, né? Então, eu chamo ela de Anne também, né? E então, tudo que nós Prof de né? Já publicou muitos livros livros, se buscarem na internet, pelo menos 8 mil ensaios em livros, né? Agora, posso fazer dois livros muito interessantes, né? Aesthetics, gente, ela pela Parmenides Press, ela lançou a tradução e o comentário da of Plotinus, né?
So, thank you, Eduardo. And I should like to start by thanking the department for inviting me to give this opening lecture in your Classical Studies week. It's a great honor to be invited to do this, and I'm especially grateful to Eduardo for suggesting my name to his colleagues and for facilitating my participation in your program, and indeed for introducing me just now. I'm sorry that I don't speak Portuguese, but Eduardo has translated my lecture into Portuguese, and you can see it on the screen, and I will try to speak slowly. And there will also be some PowerPoint slides which are going to be shown at some points in the lecture. As many of you will know, my research deals mainly with the pagan Neoplatonist philosophers of late antiquity, from the 3rd to the 6th century of the Common Era. These philosophers were keen to preserve the cultural and religious traditions that they had inherited from the classical period, although they lived in what was in many ways, politically, culturally, and religiously, a very different world. Since the theme of your week is religion and science, I thought it would be appropriate to talk to you today about the Neoplatonist approach to traditional pagan religion. That's a very large topic, so rather than attempting a general survey of the whole topic in a single lecture, I am selecting one aspect for special study as an illustration of the overall theme. Some of my own recent work has led me to think about the Neoplatonist view of the god Dionysus, and so I decided to focus on that. I shall begin by saying something about the traditional view of Dionysus, which the Neoplatonists inherited, and also by saying a bit more about the Neoplatonists and their philosophy. I think some of you know quite a bit about Neoplatonism, but some of you don't, so I will explain a little. After that, the main part of my lecture will deal with some particular aspects of the Neoplatonist treatment of Dionysus before concluding with a few more general comments. So, first of all, the traditional view of Dionysus. Let's start by looking at the view of Dionysus, which the Neoplatonists inherited from their classical predecessors. This has been well surveyed by scholars such as the great Walter Boechat in his classic textbook, Greek Religion, and I make no apology for drawing on Boechat's account here. Boechat describes Dionysus as the god of wine and of intoxicated ecstasy, and he distinguishes at least 4 types of festival held in his honor in the classical Greek world, including the Linnea and the Great Dionysia at Athens, both of which involve dramatic performances. Students of classics are well accustomed to associate Dionysus with classical Greek tragedy and comedy, and they are familiar with the way in which the god appears a character in plays such as Euripides' Bacchae or Aristophanes' Frogs. However, it's also important to note that another poetic genre involving performance by a chorus, dithyramb, was also associated with Dionysus. A number of mythical stories are told about Dionysus, of which the most familiar are probably the story of Dionysus being conceived by Semele and then transferred before he was born to the thigh of his father Zeus when Semele was destroyed by Zeus's thunderbolt. So he ends up being born from the thigh of Zeus. That's one story. Then there is the story of Dionysus and Ariadne, and also stories associating Dionysus with frenzied Maenads or Bacchantes, female worshippers who in their ecstatic madness dismember animals or even human beings, as in the case of Pentheus, the king in the Bacchae, who is dismembered by the Bacchantes. Another story, rather less well known to us, but popular with the Neoplatonists, told how the Titans distracted the infant Dionysus while he was looking into a mirror and killed, dismembered, and devoured him. His heart was saved by Athene and other remains by Apollo. The Titans were burned to the ashes from which humanity was created, while Dionysus was reborn from Semele. So this story is then connected with the other story about the birth of Dionysus. This last story about Dionysus and the Titans is associated with mystery religion and with Orphism. These stories about Dionysus were not only recounted in poetry and drama, but also portrayed in art. So if you do a Google search or a similar search of images of Dionysus in ancient art, you find a great variety of images on pottery, in sculpture, and in mosaics. And there is a PowerPoint slide, so it's the second slide in the presentation. That's the one. This slide shows an amphora, wine jar, dating from around 510 before the Common Era. This is from the open access collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you can see that on this vase, Dionysus is there in the middle. There's a satyr on one side. There's a Maenad on the other. He's holding what looks like a mixing bowl for wine. I think that's what he's holding. And there are bunches of grapes also clearly visible in the picture. And that's just one example of many similar images. We also find some references to Dionysus in the works of Plato. Three of these are particularly important for the Neoplatonic material that I'll be discussing shortly. And yes, there's a slide that came up, the third one in the presentation, thank you, which gives you these references and also some brief quotations in English. So first of all, in the Phaedo, in 69c to d, Socrates describes the philosopher as the person of true virtue, the person with a correct understanding of pleasure and pain. And he compares philosophers to initiates in the mysteries, with a quotation from an unknown source: many bear the wand, but few are Bacchantes. Bacchantes here meaning followers of Dionysus. Secondly, in the myth in Plato's Phaedrus, that's in Phaedrus 246e to 253c, Socrates describes a realm beyond the heavens in which the gods are engaged in a solemn procession, which is called a divine dance. That's 247a7. According to this myth, that's where souls really belong. And the experience there of the souls which follow Zeus with a fortunate chorus, that's the phrase that's used in 250b6, their experience is described in that whole passage in 250b4 to c5 in language associated with the Eleusinian mysteries. Souls leave this blissful state when they lose their wings and fall into bodies. So the idea is that the soul properly belongs in that divine world, but they are, when they enter bodies, they're leaving that world. Through the right kind of love, a love not of physical beauty, but of higher intelligible realities, according to this myth, a soul can grow wings once again and so return to the higher realm. Those who experience such love are described as initiates into mysteries, that's at 250e1 and 251a2, and they're compared to Bacchantes. You might say, what's this to do with Dionysus? Well, they're compared to Bacchantes at 253a6. So that's my second Plato reference. And then finally, in Magnesia, the second best ideal city described in the laws, there are going to be 3 choruses. Interestingly, that city does include choruses who perform, sing and they dance. And the third chorus, a chorus of elders, is dedicated to Dionysus as the god of wine and of choral dancing in both dithyramb and tragedy. And that's in Book 2 of the Laws, 665 and following. All right, so that's my sort of introductory part about Dionysus. I'm now going to say a little bit more about the Neoplatonists. For the Neoplatonists, by whom I mean Plotinus and his successors, from the 3rd to the 6th century of the Common Era, Plato's use of the language of mystery rites and his references to Dionysus functioned as a kind of lens through which they viewed and interpreted the religious traditions, myths, literature, and art that they had inherited from classical antiquity. And so before I explain what I mean about their using Plato as a lens, I need to say a bit more about Neoplatonism. The term Neoplatonist is used in modern scholarship to distinguish Plotinus and his successors from earlier Platonist philosophers on the grounds that the one, the supreme principle of Plotinus, his God, if you like, is transcendent in a way that the highest metaphysical principle of earlier Platonist philosophers was not. However, Plotinus didn't think he was a Neoplatonist. He didn't use that word. He regarded himself simply as a Platonist, that's to say, as an interpreter of Plato. Working in a well-established philosophical tradition, he was more concerned to validate his views by appeal to the authority of Plato than to claim any kind of originality. He developed a metaphysical system derived from Plato in which, beyond the physical world, there were 3 levels of higher reality, 3 hypostases. So there's the one, there's mind or intellect, nous in Greek, and the soul. These levels of higher reality exist independently of us. So it's like Plato's forms, which, it's very easy for us to think of Plato's forms as being somehow in the mind, but for Plato, they exist independently of anybody thinking about them. And for Plotinus, the same is true of his 3 hypostases, and Plato's forms for him come at the level of intellect, the level of nous. But at the same time, he also talks about the hypostases being within us. So this isn't just a metaphysical theory, it's also a certain kind of psychological theory. And he believes that it's possible for individual souls to ascend beyond the hypostasis of soul to the level of intellect, and even exceptionally to the one. And the ascent to the one is described in terms of mystical experience. Porphyry, Plotinus' pupil, editor, and biographer, records that Plotinus achieved such an experience 4 times during the years that Porphyry studied with him, while Porphyry himself achieved it only once. For around 300 years, philosophers following Plotinus elaborated on the metaphysical system that he had developed, using it as a framework within which to discuss a variety of philosophical problems and to interpret both Plato and Aristotle. They maintained a belief in the possibility of mystical contact with the highest principle, the one, and they have quite a lot to say about the theoretical basis of this, although they tell us virtually nothing about any actual experiences of the kind mentioned by Porphyry. Plotinus himself seems to have had little interest in traditional religion, although he makes what has been described as casual use of Greek mythology from time to time. And as we shall see, he also makes significant use of passages of Plato which allude to the mysteries and to Dionysiac rites. Porphyry, on the other hand, had wide-ranging cultural interests. He probably wrote a work entitled Philosophy from Oracles, and he was engaged in controversy against the Christians. And there's a whole dispute about how the philosophy of oracles relates to his work against the Christians, but that's not relevant here. But clearly he had these very wide cultural and religious interests. Porphyry also engaged in controversy with his contemporary Iamblichus over the value of theurgy, a kind of religious magic practiced by the Neoplatonists. And the controversy is documented in Iamblichus' work, which is commonly known as the De Mysteries, on the mysteries. So, in fact, there is a PowerPoint slide. It's the next one in the presentation. There we are, which gives you the names and dates of these philosophers that I've just been talking about. You can see Plotinus, 204 to 270 in the Common Era. Porphyry, born in 234, died round about 305. Iamblichus, born round about 245, died around 325. And then the other three people on that slide, Proclass, Demacias, and Olympiodorus, are all rather later. I'm just about to go on and talk about them. Much of our evidence for the philosophical views of Iamblichus comes from the extensive commentaries on Plato written by Proclass, who was the head of a revived Platonic academy at Athens in the 5th century of the Common Era. You will have seen in the slide, he was born in 412, he died in 485. During the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, Neoplatonism flourished in the philosophical schools of both Athens and Alexandria. Proclass' extensive philosophical works, including his surviving Platonic commentaries, derive from his teaching at Athens, as do the works of Demacias, who was the head of the Athenian Neoplatonic school in 529, which is a kind of famous date for people who study this period. That's when Justinian closed the schools. There's some discussion about just what that means, but it looks as though the Neoplatonic school in Athens was closed down and the philosophers went to Persia, at least for a time. Again, we're not sure whether they came back. The surviving commentaries of the Alexandrian Neoplatonists are mainly on works of Aristotle, but Olympiodorus, who was teaching at Alexandria in the 6th century, has left us several commentaries on Plato. So again, those were the people whose names were on the slide that you saw. Okay, the philosophers I've mentioned, oh, here they are again. Yes, thank you. So there's Proclass, Demacias, Olympiodorus at the bottom of that slide. So all these philosophers whom I've mentioned, all the people whose names are on that slide, were all pagans in an increasingly Christian world. And yes, I'm coming to the next one in a minute. We could go back to the text for the moment. Thank you. According to his pupil and biographer Marinus, Proclass practiced the rites of a variety of pagan religions, including the rites of theurgy. He also wrote hymns, 7 of which survive, including a hymn to Helios, a hymn to Aphrodite, a hymn to the Muses, and a hymn to Athene. So those are all hymns to quite traditional Greek gods. And he incorporated the traditional Greek gods into the Neoplatonic philosophical system. Excuse me. In Proclass's version of the system, below the one, the highest principle, there were what were called the divine henads, which are often said to have been identified with the gods of traditional Greek mythology. Now, in fact, things are more complicated than that, since in Proclass's system, each of the traditional gods appears as a series or chain of divine beings, so that Zeus, for instance, appears at several different levels. The very first Zeus is indeed the divine henad, while the Zeus mentioned in the myth in Plato's Phaedrus, the one who the souls are following in this divine dance, he's Zeus at the level of intellect, or nous, and then the demiurge, as in Plato's Timaeus, is Zeus at a still lower level. Well, all this is quite confusing. It's liable to make one's head spin, and it prompted a famous remark by E.R. Dodds about Homer's Olympians ending up on the dusty shelves of a museum of metaphysical abstractions. Too much concentration on the metaphysical abstractions gives the impression that Proclass and his successors were simply engaged in dry scholastic classification, and makes it very difficult to understand how they combined their study and teaching of philosophy with their religious practice. We can get closer to such an understanding if, instead of describing the overall system in general terms, we look more closely at the Neoplatonist approach to particular gods, as I now propose to do in returning to Dionysus and some exploration of what the Neoplatonists made of this god of wine, ecstasy, drama, and dancing. So now I'm coming to Dionysus. Plotinus uses the image of a dancing chorus in several passages. Particularly interesting for my concerns in this lecture is Ennead 6:9, chapter 6:9, chapter 8, lines 34 to 45, and we could have the next PowerPoint slide now. That passage describes our relationship to the One as being like that of a chorus dancing a God-inspired dance around its leader, using language which echoes the description of the divine dance of souls in the myth in Plato's Phaedrus. Similarly, Proclass, in his commentary on Plato's Timaeus, commenting not on the Phaedrus, but on the Timaeus, on a passage of the Timaeus, 40c to d, which alludes to the cosmic dance of the heavenly bodies. So he's talking about a different kind of dance, but Proclass there mentions Bacchic dances of souls following the more divine among their leaders, as Socrates says in the Phaedrus. So perhaps we could have the next PowerPoint slide now, and you can see those references and a translation of the Proclass text. Yes, thank you very much. So there's the summary of the Plotinus, and there's Proclass in Dirk Boutzley's translation. Surely then the dances of the souls are the Bacchic ones that they make around the intelligible, for they also dance when they are following the more divine among their leaders, as Socrates says in the Phaedrus. We saw earlier that Plato uses the term bacchant in both the Phaedrus and the Phaedo in contexts in which true philosophers, who are also true lovers, are described as initiates into the mysteries. When we turn to Neoplatonic interpretations of the story of Dionysus' dismemberment by the Titans, we find Dionysus associated not with the divine dance of the Phaedrus, but with the physical world, which for the Neoplatonists is partial and fragmented. Already in Plotinus, in Ennead 4:3, at the beginning of chapter 12 of that Ennead, there is an allusion to the story of Dionysus and the Titans, when Plotinus refers to souls seeing their images as if in the mirror of Dionysus, and so being drawn to descend into the physical world. Plotinus does not go into any details, and we might see this as an instance of his casual use of Greek mythology that I mentioned earlier. However, when we turn to Proclass and to the commentaries on the Phaedo written by Olympiodorus and Demacias, we find a fully developed allegorical interpretation of Dionysus' dismemberment. If we look more closely at some of what these philosophers have to say about Dionysus, we can see that the later Neoplatonists have a complex but largely consistent view of how this god fits into their philosophical and religious system. The Plotinus reference and the Proclass references I'm about to discuss are on the next PowerPoint slide. So if we could have the next slide now, I think that would be helpful. Thank you very much. So there's the quotation from Ennead 4:3 in the Loeb translation, English translation by Armstrong. The souls of men see their images as if in the mirror of Dionysus. And then there's a summary about what Proclass has to say in the commentary in the Timaeus. Proclass, in his commentary on Plato's Timaeus, describes Dionysus as the leader of the partial demiurges, whose role, like that of the lesser gods in 41a to 42e in the Timaeus, is to create individual mortal beings. But Dionysus' heart, which was saved by Athene, is interpreted as the intellect of the world, that is, the demiurge within the world. So what does all that mean? Well, the mortal beings created by the partial demiurges live in a fragmented, apparently chaotic world, just as we do. However, the Neoplatonists believed that there was an intelligible power shaping the world and giving it form, order, and meaning. Dionysus, somewhat paradoxically, but interestingly, I think, is associated not only with chaos and fragmentation, but also ultimately with order. Olympiodorus' commentary on the Phaedo begins by discussing Phaedo 61c to 62c, where Socrates argues that the philosopher should not commit suicide and refers to the idea that human beings are in the body as if in custody. So the Greek word is phroura, and Olympiodorus and Demacias take it that means being in prison, being in custody. Socrates says in the Phaedo that this idea is derived from secret teachings, that's to say, from mysteries of some kind. Discussion of the allusion to custody leads Olympiodorus to offer an interpretation of the dismemberment of Dionysus, which connects that with life in the fragmented worlds of embodiment and particularization. So we could have the next slide, I think, the next PowerPoint. Olympiodorus, thank you. Olympiodorus describes Dionysus as the patron of this world where extreme division prevails because of mine and thine. So that's the first quotation on that PowerPoint slide from 1.5 and 1.6 in the Phaedo commentary. And then he goes on to describe Dionysus as the patron of life and death. This is still on Olympiodorus. And Olympiodorus goes on to comment on the association of Dionysus with wine and prophetic ecstasy. His point seems to be that, and I'm quoting now L.G. Westerink, who translated Olympiodorus and commented on him. I think Westerink's got this right. The point seems to be that Dionysiac rapture, prophetic inspiration, and death are different ways in which the soul is separated from the visible world. So that's Olympiodorus, who's got he has Dionysus as the patron of Genesis, the patron of life, but he's also associated with death and separation from the physical world. Now, Demacias too, and now we're on the next slide, Demacias too discusses Dionysus' dismemberment. First of all, at the beginning of his commentary on the Phaedo, so you could show the next PowerPoint slide at this point. At the beginning of Demacias, thank you very much, the beginning of Demacias' commentary on the Phaedo, in a passage which survives in a rather fragmentary state. This is the first 12 sections of his Phaedo commentary, and then again a bit later in sections 165 to 72. The first passage, like the passage of Olympiodorus that I've just discussed, comments on Socrates' argument in 61c to 62c that the philosopher should not commit suicide, while the second one comments on 69c to d, the passage that I mentioned earlier, which alludes to bacchantes. According to Demacias, Plato's pupil and successor, Xenocrates, referred to Dionysus and the Titans in explaining the allusion to custody, phroura in Greek, at 62b. So it looks as though this interpretation, or some version of it, actually goes right back to the generation immediately after Plato. Demacias assumes that his students know the story. His commentary is based on his lectures, and as I say, he assumes that his students know what he's talking about. He mentions Porphyry's interpretation of the story, and then he goes on to give his own view, concluding that Dionysus is both indivisible and divisible. The god is undivided when seated on the throne of Zeus, but divided when proceeding from there into the universe. Human beings, born from the ashes of the Titans who consumed Dionysus, resemble both the Titans and Dionysus. So when we are fragmented and irrational, we are titanic, but according to Demacias in his Phaedo commentary 1.9, lines 6 to 8, when we recover that lost unity, we become Dionysus and we attain what can truly be called completeness. So Dionysus can set us free, but it's not up to us to decide when that will happen. So again, linking up with the Phaedo, the philosopher should not commit suicide. When he comes to comment on Phaedo 69c to d, Demacias considers the parallel between philosophical and ritual ways of approaching the gods, and he compares progression in the virtues to progression through the grades of mysteries. So the Neoplatonists thought of the virtues as being in a kind of scale, and Demacias is drawing a parallel between that scale and the grades of the mysteries. And so he declares that, and I'm quoting Demacias now, I'm quoting section 171 from the first part of his video commentary. Demacias says, the first Bacchus is Dionysus, whose ecstasy manifests itself in dancing and shouting. That is, in every form of movement of which he is the cause according to the laws. So that's actually alluding to laws 2, 672, A5 to D4, which is part of the passage about the chorus of Dionysus. Just going on with the quotation, and when a man leads a Dionysian life, his troubles are already ended, and he is free from his bonds and released from custody. Such a man is the philosopher in the stage of purification. Yes, thank you. So you can see that quotation there. That's the second quotation on that slide that's just gone up from the PowerPoint about the first Bacchus is Dionysus, with the and making interestingly, I think, made connection with the laws. Although there are differences of detail between the treatments of Dionysus and his dismemberment found in these late Neoplatonic texts, and there are some differences of detail between Olympiodorus and Demacias that we don't need to discuss this evening or this afternoon. Although there are differences of detail, an overall picture does emerge. So what's the overall picture? Dionysus is a god associated with a partial, fragmented, and apparently chaotic world in which we live as mortal beings. Involvement in Dionysic mysteries can help us to make sense of that world and to grasp how it is related to a higher, intelligible reality. In the classical period, involvement in Dionysiac mysteries meant celebrating festivals in honor of Dionysus with wine, drama, dancing, and sometimes a frenzied group ecstatic experience. However, for the Neoplatonists, it means something much more intellectual, although not exclusively so. Perhaps it does still involve actual choral dancing and initiation to mystery rites of some kind, as well as the practice of theurgy. It also involves the study of Plato and coming to understand his philosophy in Neoplatonic terms, but it's not exclusively intellectual, since the Neoplatonic one is above and beyond the realm of intellect and can only be reached by surpassing intellectual experience. So, I mean, there's this kind of paradox that you reach the one through a mystical experience, but you have to do all the intellectual stuff as well. So they're somehow combining the two. Okay, I come to my conclusion. The Neoplatonist approach to Dionysus is thus typical of their approach, the religious traditions which they had inherited from a pagan classical past. In some ways, it's very bookish, heavily influenced by Plato and by other texts, such as Orphic poems. Mythical stories are interpreted allegorically in a way which may seem both arbitrary and fanciful to us, in order to make their teaching consistent with Neoplatonist metaphysics. We seem to be a long way from the ritual practices of the classical period and the experiences of those who took part in such rituals. So if you think of what I said at the beginning of the lecture about Dionysiac festivals and so on, the kind of rituals that are described, for instance, by Boechat in his book on Greek religion, we seem a long way from that. Yet it would be wrong to conclude that the religion of the pagan Neoplatonists was entirely theoretical and intellectual. Porphyry's report of Plotinus and his own rare mystical experiences, Marinus' account of Proclass' pious religious practice, and the commitment of many, although not all Neoplatonists, from the time of Iamblichus onwards to the practice of theurgy, all point the other way, towards active commitment to religious practice and at least the possibility of religious experience. They just don't tell us, really, whether they had such experiences. Perhaps they didn't, but they certainly believed that they were possible. For some of us in the modern world, the Neoplatonist combination of complex intellectual philosophizing with what is in some ways a very traditional approach to religion is hard to understand, especially as our knowledge of the Neoplatonists comes from their extensive surviving texts, which tell us a lot more about their philosophizing than their religious practice. So I think it may be partly to do with the kind of evidence that we have. We have the evidence for all the philosophizing. We don't have the evidence for the practice. I said at the beginning that the Neoplatonists of late antiquity lived in a very different world from that of classical Greece. The world in which we live in the 21st century is, of course, in many ways utterly different from either late antiquity or classical Greece. Nevertheless, we too face challenges of how to combine the kind of understanding afforded by intellectual activities such as philosophy with the satisfaction that many people obtain from performing religious rituals and with the full range of human experience. Studying the Neoplatonist attempts to effect such a combination may help us not only to understand the past, but also perhaps to understand ourselves. So thank you for your attention.
Obrigado, Anne. Muito obrigado, pessoal. Então eu peço desculpas pelo problema lá da conexão mais cedo, né? Sorry, and I'm apologizing for the problems with my connection earlier on. Like just when I was supposed to introduce you. So anyway, I'm just making just finish my introduction. What I was supposed to say before your paper. Then I'll start with the questions. Huh?
Okay, that's fine.
Então, pessoal, tá ótimo. Então, pedir desculpas aí pelo problema com a conexão. Agora já foi resolvido. Então, olha, acho que o final da minha apresentação da professora Anne Sheppard foi o seguinte, que ela tudo que se espera de uma British Scholar, né? Escreveu vários livros, organizou coleções de artigos, organizou livros, e tem 2 livros que Fantasia... It's Allegory in Fantasia. Sorry, and the name of your book is the
the Poetics of Fantasia. That's what it's called.
Yeah. And ela traduziu o comentário ela traduziu um livro, uma sessão do Plotino da Enéadas 1:8 para a prestigiosa Parmenides Press, né? E então, é uma professora emérita. Now, so I think that was the bit that was missing there in the. So anyway, and so before I pass to my colleagues the opportunity to ask questions to you, I'll tell you something that always occurs to me. That is, to be honest, since the 1st century BC, you think about Lucretius and all the Epicurean trend in the late Roman Republic, it's very difficult to think that they still believe in God, in the gods, in the traditional Greek gods, like in the 5th and 6th century AD. So what do you think?
I mean, the Epicureans are a particular group, obviously, who were very, as you know, who didn't believe in the traditional gods. But I think there is evidence for pagan cult and so on continuing, and even in the time of Proclass in the 5th century, when obviously Christianity was very widespread, there was still pagan temples and so on, more than you might expect. So what does that mean? What did the people who were going to these temples believe?
Yeah.
I would imagine that there would be a range of beliefs, that ordinary people would still perhaps have some quite traditional beliefs. I think, and so for the Neoplatonists, it's in some ways a very intellectualized belief. but they are somehow trying to combine traditional gods with, as I said, with their philosophy. And obviously there were other people who wouldn't accept that, but I think there were a range of views, and I think the Platonists do continue a kind of traditional belief, despite the sort of things that people like Lucretius were saying.
But what I mean when I say like the Epicurean trend in like the 1st century BC, I think about it's not like me. By people, I mean, there's a sort of consensus. There was, I think, it was the society itself stopped believing the gods. What I'm saying that, I mean, all right, these people speculate, Proclass, they speculate about the gods, but did it reach the common man?
Well, we don't know, do we? I mean, again, for what it's worth, as I mentioned, Marinus talks about Proclass performing the rites of a lot of different religions. He must have been very busy.
But
I mean, as far as the common man goes, I think all you can do is probably look at archaeological evidence, in which I'm no expert. But as I say, pagan temples actually carried on. So
yeah,
it's difficult, isn't it? Because you're trying to put together different kinds of evidence, and over a very wide area of the Mediterranean world, was some more continuing belief in some areas than others. I don't know.
because
and I suppose I think there's also evidence, what I would call a kind of interest in, if you like, in spirituality. Perhaps that's a word that I should have used somewhere in my talk. People still being interested in the mysteries, and of course the rise of Christianity is in a way evidence of people's desire for some sort of what should I say, a spirituality, an interest in something religious, even if it's something rather different from pagan religion.
Yeah, because it's somehow connected with that point that I read it in one book about like the late antiquity society and philosophy, that I like the sort of the philosopher, they didn't get into politics, or I'm right that the late antiquity philosophy, it's not they didn't maybe it's just a prejudice, but that was sort of it, at least like 20 years ago.
No, I think they kept away from active involvement in politics, although
exactly.
I mean, they had a bit more theoretical interest in politics than I think they had more theoretical interest, if you like, than they've sometimes been credited with, but they didn't get very involved with it actively. And again, as time went on, I mean, being a pagan would be a big disadvantage, would be trying to be politically active, I think, by Proclass's time.
Because somehow it's connected, because religion is politics, as we know today, don't we? Like, so it's sort of the distance they kept from politics. It might signalize that. I mean, sort of again, sort of the common man was away from this sort of religious cult, like or the traditional religion. Anyway, it's just a thought. Anyway, I'll pass. I'll pass to the other. I can read here. People are really interested in making questions. So how it's going to work? I mean,
yes, I saw that there are questions coming up at the bottom of the screen. So are you are you going to read them out? And I think you may have to translate them for me.
Yeah, no, I just.
Somebody's asking about the availability of the text.
Será disponibilizado, sim. Será sim. Então. Boa. Is it? I think that there's a question here. how far the Neoplatonic representation of Dionysus was influenced by the mythical Roman tradition. How much the mythical Roman tradition, like, I mean, probably the traditional religion, Roman religion, how much it did it influence, the Neoplatonics?
Well, I mean, I think that the myths and so on that the Neoplatonists are drawing on, and they say they're particularly interested in this myth about the dismemberment of Dionysus by the Titans. So those are Greek myths. I mean, I think, gosh, there are also Roman traditions specifically about Bacchus, which you find reflected in something like the poetry of Horace. I think those are less prominent in the Neoplatonists. I mean, although the Neoplatonists are living under the Roman Empire, they were writing, the people I'm talking about were writing in Greek. They were living in a very Greek culture. So I think it's classical Greek tradition that is influencing them, that they're making use of.
Cool. Now, yeah. Now the question of our colleague Marcus Reis. He's going to be part of the next event.
Mm-hmm.
Can you add something like that? In Plotinus' quotation, the Dionysic dance, is it linked to the apex of its system? I mean, the contemplation of the nous towards the one. That's
yes. In the passage that I quoted, yes, that's the answer. Yes, I mean, Plotinus uses the idea of choral dancing in several different ways, and in fact, so this is something that I have written about in a paper which has just been published in a journal called Classics Ireland, which is as a fellowship for Professor Andrew Smith. It's literally come out this week. So he uses the notion of choral dancing in different ways, but the passage that I was referring to, it is around the one. And I think when he's making the Dionysiac connection, it's particularly when he's talking about dancing around the one. So again, associating it with mystical experience.
Now, there's a nice, interesting question now. Was Dionysus downgraded in the history of Neoplatonism, or there's an alternative reading? You mean was he like neglected, like downgraded?
No, I don't think so. I think they think he's quite important. So, I mean, obviously, I've chosen to focus on him, but he does seem to have quite an important role for them. It's kind of difficult because certainly if you go back to the classical period, Dionysus is sometimes presented as a sort of a god who's somehow coming in from outside, who has he's sometimes presented as a god who has an origin outside Greece. Again, I think the modern scholars disagree about whether that's really true, but that's how he's sometimes presented. He's presented as a bit different from what we think of as the Olympian gods. But he goes on he's pretty important, I think, in the classical period, if you think about things like dramatic festivals. And I think he's pretty important for the Neoplatonists as well. So I wouldn't say he was downgraded. But I might not be quite, I mean, Eduardo has translated the question, but I might not be quite taking the point of the question, I think.
Marcos, would you like articulate your question, like in the meaning of rebaixado? What? Hey, Marcos, quer falar alguma coisa sobre rebaixado? What do you mean by rebaixado? Downgraded is a good word? Anyway. Well.
Okay, so that one is in English. So somebody's saying, why did I choose this research? Okay, so I chose to talk about Dionysus today because I hoped it would fit in with the theme of your week. As to why I'm interested in the late Neoplatonists, I think it's something to do with actually what I said at the end, that they have this combination of being very intellectual, very philosophical, but they're trying to make sense of some experiences which are not intellectual. So I first became interested in this because I was interested in their views about literature, but aesthetic experiences are not entirely intellectual, and religious experiences are not either. And I think I don't have an answer, but I think I'm interested in this combination of, as I say, people who are very intellectual, but who are trying somehow to make room for experiences which are not so intellectual, if that makes sense.
So Marcus Reis is back.
Mm-hmm.
Because did you get it? Because in the late Platonic philosophers, he is connected to the sensible world. So that's why he would be downgraded.
Oh, Dionysus. Okay, I see. Yes, right. Okay, but that's where this idea that Dionysus can also be a god who sets you free is very interesting. Yes, I see what you're saying. I understand now. So he's not just connected with the sensible world. He seems, I mean, you're right. There is a lot of emphasis on Dionysus and the sensible world, but at the same time, there seems to be the idea that participation in the mysteries, and that seems to include Dionysic mysteries, can take you out of that world. So that's why there's a kind of paradox there. Yeah. I think your colleague Marcus and I are actually agreeing on this one.
Yeah. No, he's an expert in Neoplatonic studies. So I've got a question here. Has to do that I myself interested. It has to do with my research. So like my research, I mean, he touched sort of Middle Platonism. So I would say that the main difference between what I grasped so far regarding the difference between Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism is that whereas there's two principles, there's as I was telling you before, there's in Pythagorean, like classical Pythagorean philosophy, and what it reaches Middle Platonism. You've got like the opposites. So you've got like the one, and you've got matter, and they are both principles, and they are both opposites, and they basically have the same power. They as power, although like it's sort of the matter is like it's not God, but since it's an opposite, and since both interact, they would be like so you can speculate that they've got two opposite principles. Whereas in Neoplatonism, you have the ascension of the one, and the one it created the rest. So it's a sort of by my opinion, it's a sort of return to Plato, and not to Pythagorean, sort of the form.
I see what
the
you're
form
saying.
The form does everything, and the matter just obeys.
Well, certainly that's true about Neoplatonism. I think the picture in Middle Platonism is complicated. I think there are some Middle Platonists who think there are two principles, and there are some who are not so. Who think there's just one. But you're right that the Neoplatonists are very clear that they're very definite that there is no opposing principle to the one. I mean, I think if I understood correctly in your remarks about me, you mentioned that I've I have something coming out with Parmenides Press, which is a translation and commentary on Ennead 1.8 and Plotinus. That's all about this. It's all about
good to know. Excellent.
It's all about Plotinus trying to explain evil, which is a classic problem. But he's very clear there that that matter is not an opposing principle. And then he, as I say, explaining it in some other way is quite difficult, but it's very clear what his overall position is. No, that's quite correct. Yeah.
So yeah, but what would be the connection of this difference between the religion conceptions in Middle-Platonism? Or would you articulate a sort of, would you speculate between the difference between what religion meant for the Middle-Platonism and what on your paper now, what it meant for the Neoplatonism? So you just said that, that Plotinus was trying to understand evil and the source of it. That's a sort of like, this is that's a sort of dealing with the second, with the other principle.
So he doesn't, as I say, he's very clear. He doesn't want to say that evil is a principle. Well, I suppose, concerned with what you might call the problem of evil, as it's often called by philosophers and theologians. I mean, that is a kind of religious concern, I suppose. And again, there are different religious approaches to it. And you're right, this is very much an area where philosophy and religion kind of overlap. So I think that Plotinus' insistence that the one is a supreme principle fits in with some of the things that I was talking about in my lecture, about a little bit about the interest in mystical experience and so on, that what you're doing, you're striving to, well, Plato would say you're striving to become like God. You're striving to somehow attain to the one. And there's a very firm belief that the world is ultimately ordered by providence and all the rest of it, as in the Stoics, with whom you're very familiar.
The early
and
Stoics.
So I mean So it kind of connects with what I was talking about, because I think this association of Dionysus with a sensible world that your colleague Marcus was drawing attention to, that emphasized the idea that the physical world is fragmented and, I said, partial and so on, chaotic. That's, well, Plotinus would say that's where evil sort of manifests itself. But you don't just stay stuck in that world. And from his perspective, what shall I say, you're always aiming at something higher. And that's a certain kind of religious perspective, I suppose, as well as a philosophical one.
Good. And I'm going to ask, alguém tem uma questão aí, pessoal? Mas Marcos, Simone. Bom, alguém tem mais uma questão? Parece. Bom, bom, eu perguntei, então também I think it's time as well. It's like we are nearly reach our limit. So, thank you very much for your paper. And it's like people are asking whether it's going to be available. I think it's going to be available. We I think probably are going to publish the original version in our journal, the Calliope, of course, if you agree.
Thank you.
And so of course people were interested and instigated by your thoughts. And so what I can say.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for the questions. I hope sometime to be able to discuss in person with you all, which would be
like see you in 2 years, like in 2 years' time, when everything's like the world is going to be the same again. Hopefully, we can invite you to come.
Well, that would be very enjoyable.
Yeah.
So it would be, as I say, having met people online, it'd be very nice to meet everybody in person. But thank you very much. Okay, thank you,
man. So, tá.
Bom, gostaria mais uma vez de agradecer muito à professora Anne Sheppard. We like to thank you, Professor Anne Sheppard, for your speak. E então agora nós gostaria de lembrar a vocês que nós temos a nossa programação, como consta aí na aba de vocês, passando a leitura. Nós temos agora a próxima atividade, às 16h30, a nossa mesa redonda, cujo título geral da mesa é A Físis e o Divino na Antiguidade Tardia, com os professores, então, Marcos Reis, que está aqui presente, Bruno Gripe e Rafael Viegas. Então, cada um falando depois sobre um tema específico, né, com título específico. Então, nós convidamos a todos, lembrando que o link agora também da nossa próxima transmissão é outro, né? Outra salinha lá que vocês têm na programação. E, mais uma vez, eu queria também pedir desculpas a vocês no início, né, ao atraso um pouco nessa programação. Nós tivemos alguns problemas técnicos do início com a transmissão, mas agora já corre tudo dentro da programação prevista. Então, agradeço muito pela presença de todas e todos e aguardamos na nossa próxima sessão, então. Boa tarde e muito obrigada.